Okay, good evening, Rav. Our question is, who are we? What is our soul and what happens when we die?
Who are we? What is our soul? And what happens to us? So, this is a very important way of thinking about this, as opposed to asking the question of what happens to us after 120, after a person passes on, which is one way of thinking about it. There is, when you think about it that way and you say, who are we, what happens after 120? The classical answer, the way people want to say, is that after 120 is that the soul survives, and that's how we have immortality through our soul. But the truth is, when we say that statement, there's a few problems with the statement. We're not defining it. We're saying the soul survives. What is a soul? And so it seems like just a romantic idea. The soul survives the self. But more importantly, the question is if the soul, the way we'll generally understand, if the soul is sort of the enlivening force that animates the body, gives life to ourselves, the highest, the life force that gives us life, then saying that the soul survives would be parallel to this idea of saying that a person has a computer, has his whole hard drive, he has all this information on his hard drive, and one day his computer dies, and he goes to get his computer fixed, and they tell him that everything is erased from the computer. There's no more hard drive, no information is there. But there's good news, they salvage the plug. You have the plug, you can reboot the computer, which doesn't mean anything. That's not going to help you. Same thing also, if we think about the soul as the soul being the spark of the body and saying that after 120, the spark of self survives, then it's just like the spark is like the plug. The electricity that runs, the spiritual electricity that runs through it survives. But when we talk about the survival of self, and certainly when we talk about the soul surviving, we have to understand this on a much deeper level, that we're actually talking something about not just the spiritual quality of the person, but the entirety of the person. Now this itself is, to be honest, is a very big topic. It's a big conversation. It would do well if people read this book called The Jewish Book of Life After Life. It's in English, it's in Russian, it's in Spanish, it's in Portuguese, it's in any language you want. It's in Hebrew, it's called Neshama Lach, God willing. And over there it's explained with all the sources exactly how this works. But let's try to understand a little bit to begin with. When we say the survival of self, that we survive, and what happens after 120, the real question is, the initial question is who are we? That's why I'm having a conversation with you right now. What's the definition of me at this present moment? So when we think about self, or selfhood, when we think about ourselves, so selfhood and self is a composite of a lot of different qualities. We have a certain genetic makeup, which is our nature. We have a certain type of natural inclinations, a certain type of intelligence, a certain way of feeling things, which is already part of our genetic makeup, part of our nature. Certain parts of ourself is part of our nurture, how we were developed, through how we were nurtured through our education, through the things that we know, through the things we learn. And essentially, throughout life, or if you try to define yourself, let's say you're a 40-year-old person, and you say, who am I right this present moment? And in a way that you know yourself. So I'll say, I know this person. Let's say I know this so-and-so who's a 40-year-old. When you say you know this person, what does it mean that you know them? It doesn't mean that you know how they look, because you can know how someone looks and you actually don't know them. What it means about you know them is you know how they're going to respond. You know how if you tell them something, you know what their thought process is going to be. You know how they're going to emotionally react to the certain things that you're telling them. And the way to predict that, even for yourself, to know yourself, is to to understand that life at any present moment is the totality of all your experiences / your nurture and your nature plus all your experience that you had, everything you ate, everything you talked about, every experience that you had, every type of stimuli that entered into your body. The entirety of the self is all the experiences having an experience in the present. That's the fullness of self is the entirety of self, of all the experiences, all the thoughts, all the words, all the actions that you've done up until this present moment. Having an experience in the present. And another way of saying it is that you are memory, not conscious memory, but you are memory having an experience in the present. And then the experience in the present, whatever that experience is, that becomes eventually memory a moment later. So the entirety of self, if I say I know myself, says I know the way I think. How do I know the way I think? Because the way I thought up until this point. How do I know the way I'm going to feel about it? Because how I felt up until this point. From the experiences, from everything that I had up until this present moment, that's how I know, that's what it says, I know myself. I know how I'm going to think about something and how I'm going to feel about it. Of course, I'm open to new experiences at every moment, therefore I can constantly change. So there's the part of the self, like we'll say that there's the part of self is like the autobiographical self, which is constantly being written and developed, is the self that's constantly encountering experiences through life, and the experiencer, the self, is having these experiences, and that constitutes self. Is this kind of clear what the definition of self is? So what does that have to do with the soul? What does that have to do with the soul? So when we talk about memory, so let's think about this like this. Now, when we think about memory, we think about this more in terms of brain memory. So there's the brain at the beginning of life, the beginning of birth, and sort of like a tabula rasa, but there's some type of like, unsubscribed narrative that's yet written on the story of the brain. And throughout life, we write memories of experiences that's accumulated on the brain. Now, the brain in itself, the physical brain, is not really the storage house of memory. It's not exactly the place where memory is stored, because the brain is more like a jamming system that allows for certain memories to become revealed to yourself and certain memories to not. Based on the past experiences, if you were to see something, let's say two people walking down the street and they see the exact same thing, each person will register a different memory based on the past experiences. Let's say one person is an architect and one person is a business person. You see a building, the architect will see the architecture, and even though they're seeing everything else, and there's a price tag on the building, and the person that's into business will see only the price tag, will not see the architecture, because the brain is selective. The brain memory is very selective, so it chooses based on its past experiences what it needs. It says, okay, I need to remember architecture because that's what I do for a living. That's part of my ego. That's part of my story, part of my narrative. Therefore, that's the things that I'm going to remember. This is one level of memory. But then there's a deeper level of memory, which is a soul memory. Now, soul memory means that in the beginning of life, every single person is born with a particular soul. Exactly how this works is a bigger conversation, but every person is born with just like a person has a genetic pattern, a particular genetic makeup, therefore they have a certain body, they're, this height, that height, this width, this length, this coloring. Every person has a genetic makeup, and part of the genetic makeup, part of their genetic makeup is their level of intelligence, the type of emotions, the things that inherit them from the parents, etc. This is all a reflection, a physical reflection of a spiritual quality. That the reason why one person is tall, one person is short, one person looks like this, one person looks like that, one person has this type of intelligence, one person that has the other type of intelligence, on a genetic level, purely on a nature level, is because every single individual person has a particular soul type already at birth. There's like a soul signature. There's a particularity to the soul. So the soul is not completely blank at the beginning of birth. It's blank in terms of experiences. There's no experiences yet. But it has a certain inclination. It means already at birth, even pre-birth, the soul will enter into a body that will be conducive for it to articulate its soul potential. So let's say a person that has an inclination, a spiritual inclination, for whatever reason, for the soul to articulate, let's say, kindness in this world, to be a giver, will end up migrating or transmigrating or reincarnating, however you want to understand this, into a body that will have the conditioning, the sociological conditioning, the physical conditioning that will allow for this soul to articulate chesed. This is just on a very general level, but it works even much more specifically, that the body type that we have and the particular genetic patterns that we have and nature that we have, some persons are more intelligent, less intelligent, is because the soul has a very specific way that it needs to express itself in this world. And based on the particular type of expression that it has to express itself in this world, it's choosing, Hashem chooses, its body through which it will come through in this world. So in the beginning of birth, the soul has an inclination. It has a certain inclination towards certain things, but it's an empty paper. There's nothing's written. There's no story that's written on it. And then throughout life, at moment to moment, every single moment that we're alive, we're taking in more impressions, and these are becoming imprinted on the fabric of our soul. And every single experience of every single thought that we thought, every single word that we spoke, every single action that we did, and every single impression, everything we saw and heard and our senses were awake to, every single experience becomes imprinted onto the very fabric of the soul. Okay? So when a person passes on, now let's think about this. Since the totality of self is our memory, and I'm not talking about conscious memory, because conscious memory sometimes people don't even remember what they had yesterday for lunch, and rightfully so. But since the totality of ourselves is our memory, and therefore there's certain subconscious reactions and actions that we do in this world based on our previous experiences that were imprinted on our memory. After 120, once the brain dies, that's really essentially what happens after a person passes on from this world. The brain and the heart dies. The self not only survives death, but more the self becomes revealed at the moment of death. Because during life, in order for us to become conscious of our memories, the brain eliminates that and doesn't allow us, the ego, doesn't allow us to have full access to our memory. Because maybe it's inconsistent to who we want to be in this world and that memory, so we dismiss that memory. But at the moment a person passes on, they can't create new memory because they don't have the senses, there's no more eyes and ears, etc., to create new memory. Therefore, whatever the soul reached that level at the moment of a person passes on, that's the soul level that a person reaches. That's the culmination of the person's life. And there's no more movement in the world to come, in the afterlife. So the afterlife, in a strange way to say this, is that there is really no difference between a person that's a moment before they pass on versus the moment after they pass on. In fact, I would say that a person is even more alive technically, in terms of his memory. The fullness of self becomes revealed at a moment after a person passes on. This is the first understanding. So when we talk about the survival that a person survives, the survival of death, what happens after a person passes on, forget about what happens. What actually is the experience of after a person passes on? Again, we're not talking about the soul as a spiritual entity of self. We're talking about the soul as the backdrop that's holding the entire memory of self. And then begins a process. Then there begins a process. And the process is that certain memories and certain experiences have to be dropped, and certain can be retained. And that's the process. But in general, the way the Zohar, one of the classic works of on Kabbalah, explains the process is that after a person passes on, they see the light of the Shekhinah, they see the presence of the Shekhinah, the light of the Shekhinah, of Hashem's presence. And im zacha, if they're meritorious, and if they're refined, they go out, they expire in this great light. Obviously, this is a metaphor, not literal. In this great light, and they become one with their source, with the Kadosh Baruch, with Hashem. They return back. Return back to their source. And if God forbid, if If the opposite, which means the person is not refined, they're not refined means the person is very much attached, very much anchored in the physical world, very much attached to their experiences within this physical world, that same light that appears to one as very welcoming can experience the other can appear to another person as something that's very threatening, because it's it challenges a person to let go of their ego, and that could be something that's welcoming and a person can transcend, or that can be the opposite. And the experience is the way it's spoken about in Mishayar and other Kabbalistic sources. His idea is that the individual memory, which is the retention of the individual memory, returns and it goes back and becomes part of Bina. Bina is like the divine intelligence, which is, to say it in a more philosophical term, would be sort of like part of the collective memory. An image of this would be, which is very important to understand this image, is that classically there's like this famous parable of saying that, you begin life before life becomes individuated, before consciousness becomes separate, is that everything exists within this great pool of water. So there's this oneness, this unity, and then in life there emerges a wave, and that becomes your individual self, your particular soul consciousness, your particular soul type and soul signature that develops as a wave. And after 120, the wave returns back into the ocean. But that's not true. It's partially true. The wave does return back into the ocean, but it retains being a wave. Here's almost like the paradoxical statement over here, because it originates from a place of a singularity, where there's no individuation yet. Then it becomes individual, which means it has a particular task, a particular tikkun, a particular purpose that it has to be manifested in this world, and it becomes a wave of you and me and another person. Every person is distinct and unique, just like our bodies are unique, our consciousnesses are unique, our souls are unique, and rightfully so. There's like inherent value to that. And then, if we shine and we're zacha and we refine ourselves, then the wave returns back into the ocean, into the oneness, but now it's no longer as a singularity, but it's a unity. And unity means that the wave retains being a wave while it simultaneously goes back into the ocean. And that's the return of the soul back into its root as an individual self. So the soul holds on to memory. How much of the soul holds on to memory? Well, that's really depends how much eternity we experience in the present in our lives. A person that lives a life of every moment connected to eternity, every moment's connected to the nitzchias, to something that's the Torah, mitzvahs, to something that's eternal, then every single experience that they have, every thought and every emotion, every experience that they had will be nitzchi, will be everlasting, and therefore they experience the fullness of self. And in contrast, the Torah, the way it describes, in the most extreme example is that a person experiences karas, like the erasing of self, which means the loss of memory, of total memory. And the loss of total memory means the wave returns back into the ocean, it retains being a wave, but there's no narrative to the wave. It just has its distinct quality that when it entered into this world. So that's an important part of understanding our journey, that we have a particular way of being in this world that we're supposed to be. And they're all consistent. Our body is like a glove to our hand, to our soul. And we have to just be aware of why am I carrying this body? Why am I in this environment? Why are these my parents? Are these my siblings? Why do I have this type of intelligence? Why do I just have to have these type of emotions? And to recognize that there's an intention, this divine intention. Hashem has an intention that you should be in your own beautiful way to shine in your very particular way. And that's the way we reach our tikkun.
Wow, that's very, very, very fascinating. Thank you, Rabbi.
It's clear also, everything's...
There's so much to think about. You gave so much. Just this perspective of the brain, rather than being the source of memory, but being really a filter. And
correct.
That limits the extent that we actually have in it a grasp on all of our, or the totality of our memory.
The totality of self, really. Totality of self.
Totality of self.
This is why people that go through near-death experiences, some people talk about this, whether it's real or not, that's a conversation. But if a person's really going through this experience, sometimes people go through near-death experiences. They're near death, they're not after death, so the brain is shutting down. And when they come out of the experience, they have memories that they never knew they knew. of siblings that passed on, or things that happened when they were very young. And it's kind of puzzling. Like, you would think that as the brain is getting weaker, less memory should become revealed. But it's almost paradoxically the opposite. They're tapping into some type of soul character that is beyond the brain. The Magen Avos, the Tajbitz talks about this. One of the Rishonim talks about it. He brings it down from earlier sources about as the brain is becoming weaker, the spirituality of the person becomes more awakened. Therefore, this week's portions we talk about in the Torah where Yaakov is giving blessings, and everyone gives blessings when they pass on, when they're about to pass on. There's reason for that, because the person is open to higher premonition, is open to higher senses of nevuah, prophecy, and seeing into the future because of that. Yeah.
Now, are there ways to tap into the fullness of self while one is still in a body? Or is it something that we just need to be in the journey, in the body?
I don't know if there's
experience that when we experience that.
The Chavis Halavavas, Ibn Bukuda, one of the great scholars in the 10th century, writes that memory. Most people say that memory is a positive thing, and forgetfulness is something that's negative. And he says it's true for the most part, but imagine you remembered every tragedy as if it happened just now.
Right, we couldn't function.
You couldn't function, or every joy. Imagine you remember the most euphoric moment that you just experienced, 20 years ago. You experienced it, right? Wouldn't allow you to experience. So Hashem created the nature of forgetfulness is part of a healthy way of living, for the totality of life to become revealed. This is when it says that. The Mishnah says that it'll be a din v'cheshbon after a person passes on, like a judgment of a person. The judgment is because your whole life just is open. The whole film just becomes revealed to you. So everything becomes revealed. But I think it's a very it's not. We're supposed to live life in the journey, and not necessarily try to, but just understand like why we're here. What's the particular thing that we're doing in this world that makes us unique is important.
Okay, thank you.